Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Chris Kavanaugh, as I was introduced, and I was the federal prosecutor who led the Department of Justice's investigation and prosecution in the aftermath of the Unite the Right riots that occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia on August 11th and 12th of 2017. To set the stage a little bit is that Charlottesville, Virginia is in central Virginia. It's home to the University of Virginia and only about 100,000 people. Back in 2017, it became a lightning rod for the domestic violent extremist movement when the local city council had voted to remove two Confederate statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Now, when people hear Charlottesville, they often think of, unfortunately now, the Unite the Right riots of August 11th and 12th of 2017, but there actually is a substantial backdrop to that to set the context. If I could have the next slide, please. In the summer of 2017, which we refer to here in Charlottesville as the Summer of Hate, after the city council had voted to remove the statues, many people came to protest or to show their distaste with the local city council's decision. On May 13th, 2017, Richard Spencer and many of his followers, they came to Charlottesville in the first torchlit march to send as a warning to the individuals that were here in Charlottesville and the citizenry here in Charlottesville that says that the local city council was making a huge mistake and that they would be coming back. On July 8th of 2017, the KKK came to Charlottesville also to similarly protest the city council's decision. And on July 8th of 2017, even though there were only 40 members of the KKK, they were overwhelmed by hundreds, close to 1,000 counter-protesters. And the criticism after July 8th of 2017 was after the members of the KKK left Charlottesville was that law enforcement was too heavy-handed in dispersing those counter-protesters. So it's against this backdrop. That we have August 11th and 12th of 2017. And if we could bring up the next slide, and we can just leave the slides up if that's helpful, and then we can go through them quickly or whatever you would like. So on August 11th of 2017, this was the torchlit march that occurred on the grounds of the University of Virginia here in Charlottesville. Everybody was expecting the big event to be Saturday, August 12th, but on August 11th, at the very last minute, we received intelligence that there would be hundreds of white supremacists that would march on UVA grounds. They used racial epithets, saying Jews will not replace us, and also shouting blood and soil. At the end of the march, they ended up around the Thomas Jefferson statue, where they were met by some few students and some counter-protesters that came to protest this torchlit march at the last moment. And there was a substantial amount of violence that occurred in the aftermath. And that was kind of the first shot across the bow that occurred on the weekend of August 11th, to let us know, to let the locals know that that weekend was going to be anything but peaceful. On the next day, on August 12th of 2017, and I was just informed, unfortunately, the slides aren't going to work, but I can set the scene just fine. As many of you had seen this on your own televisions at home, is that there was violence that filled the streets, that the white supremacists that gathered inside of the main Central Park that occurred that was there in Charlottesville were met by counter-protesters, and the violence spilled out into the streets. It was extensive, and the law enforcement at first was slow to stop it. Many people thought it was because in response to the previous criticism that had occurred earlier in July of 2017. As the day wore on, the police declared an unlawful assembly and then cleared the park and the streets of the white supremacists who had come there to protest. After this occurred, there was a parade that just impromptu happened on the streets of Charlottesville, and they were many of the counter-protesters that had come to protest racial and other forms of discrimination, and they were celebrating equality. And this is about 1:30 in the afternoon, after many of the people who came to protest had already left town or were leaving town. The air was jubilant, they were excited, and this huge crowd, as it found its way through the streets of Charlottesville, was the subject of the mass tragedy that occurred when a white supremacist by his name, James Alec Fields, drove his car at a high rate of speed into the crowd of people. He killed one, injured dozens more. And the only thing that stopped his vehicle were two other vehicles that had been parked on the other side of the protesters. And had those cars not been there, the devastation would have been far more. In the aftermath of this mass casualty event, the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division immediately started a civil rights investigation into this. And there were two main challenges that we faced in the aftermath as a federal prosecutor that was investigating this mass casualty event. The first was, as many of you know, in the immediate aftermath of the Charlottesville riots, is that the former president of the United States went on television and talked about how there were fine people on both sides. Ordinarily, as a federal prosecutor who lives here in Charlottesville, who was prosecuting a white supremacist who drove his car through a crowd of innocent people, I expected at the time that the wind would be at my back in investigating and prosecuting this case. And I soon learned that that was not going to be the case, because I was immediately viewed as an arm of the former president in our investigation, and that there were trust barriers with many of the victims and witnesses up front that we had to overcome. And slowly but surely, in working with them and proving to them and showing them that we were only interested in holding the people who committed violence that day accountable, they slowly began to realize that the Department of Justice was interested in doing just that, holding people accountable for the hate crimes that were committed that day. The second challenge about this was that, as we just mentioned, the lead statute that we were using was the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Act, the Hate Crime Prevention Act of 18 U.S.C. 249, which requires us to show not only what happened, but why an individual did it, that they were motivated by the victims or someone's membership in a protected class, their race, their color, their religion, their national origin. In many hate crimes, such as in Dylan Roof, a lot of times the perpetrator will leave a manifesto or some sort of evidence as far as exactly why he or she was committing the crime, because there's a point to be made. Here, we didn't have that. So this was required a broad investigation to look and to be able to prove circumstantially that James Fields was motivated by race, color, religion, national origin of the victims that he had struck that day. Now, of course, James Fields, it was easy to show that he was a white supremacist. It was easy to show that he was here in town for a white supremacist rally. But it's actually more difficult than that for us to be able to do that. So it was ultimately, it was a very aggressive theory for us to show why he attacked the people in this particular crowd. And we were able to show that that crowd was diverse. We were able to show that that crowd had, in many cases, that they were celebrating equality and protesting racial discrimination. And ultimately, that was able to get us over the hump and being able to prosecute this case. In other cases, there was an instance of a local African-American man who, this was prominently displayed, where he had been severely beaten by a group of white supremacists in a parking garage. And this was a case that was ultimately prosecuted by the state, but it was initially investigated by the Department of Justice as a potential hate crimes case. And this also kind of shows some of the challenges that you face as a federal prosecutor in prosecuting a hate crime, is again, you have to be able to show what the motivation was. And although DeAndre Harris, the victim in that case, was African-American, and he received a savage beating from many of the individuals who perpetrated it, who were white and were white supremacists. As we dug into the evidence showed in that case that DeAndre Harris had previously struck an individual with a flashlight right before his assault. And this would allow a defense to argue that the hate crime in that case was not motivated by the individual's race, but in fact was motivated as revenge for him striking someone else right before. It is true that you can't have mixed motives when you're perpetrating a hate crime, but nevertheless, you have to be able to show that the race of the victim or that the bias motivation was a but-for cause. And ultimately, this was a perfect example of coordinating with our state and local authorities, who then were able to prosecute the perpetrators of that assault in local state court, where that sort of defense would not be available, where they wouldn't be able to be prosecuted with a hate crime, but they also wouldn't be able to claim a defense that the reason that they were attacking DeAndre Harris was not because of his race. And they all received in state court between 3 and 10 years of incarceration. Last and finally is that, as the third example, was the Rise Above movement. And this was a perfect example of a case that was federally prosecuted. This was a white supremacist organization that had traveled across state lines. They had previously engaged in acts of violence in California at protests in Huntington Beach and Berkeley, and then were looking to effectuate the same amount of violence here on the streets of Charlottesville. And their members came here to town and began assaulting, punching, kicking, and choking protesters that were on the street here in Charlottesville. For the Rise Above movement, the difficulty with this prosecution was that we couldn't necessarily show that their assaults were racially motivated. This was an organization that most certainly had white supremacist views. It was an organization that was also intent on committing acts of violence against people who were their political enemies. And the last tool that we could use in a case like this was the riot statute, the federal riot statute, which had not been used in decades before. You may know this statute from the Netflix series about the Chicago 7, which had been used to prosecute Abby Hoffman back in the late 70s. And it was quite ironic, especially to the white supremacists, that this statute was now being used to prosecute them. And that was successfully used to prosecute for acts of violence that they had committed after traveling interstate to effectuate their political agenda. At the end, by using some of these tools, ultimately the department was able to achieve and be able to send a message. A couple of things. Number one is that we would be aggressive in seeking and investigating acts of violence against people because of their race, color, and religion, national origin, or their membership in any other protected class. And the reason why that was just so important is that when you have a hate crime, not only are the effects of that hate crime felt by the individual who is the subject of the assault, but it's felt by all of the members of that protected class and actually felt beyond. And it is my hope that after some of these prosecutions, that after the James Fields prosecution, after the prosecutions of the Rise Above movement, that a message was sent that the United States Department of Justice would seek to hold people accountable when they committed hate crimes.
Thank you so much. Last year, I was at a restaurant in Los Angeles waiting in line to order my lunch when a man came up to me and handed me his business card and asked me to go out with him. I respectfully declined and told him, no, I'm sorry, I'm married. He then snatched the business card from me and told me to go back to Asia, followed by 2 minutes of hateful, derogatory, and sexist remarks. I started recording the altercation in hopes that it would not become a physical altercation. I needed to stay inside the restaurant because I would have witnesses inside. I asked for help from those around me, and they did the best they could do under the circumstances. About 2 minutes later, the employees were finally able to ask him to go to the other side of the restaurant. I started calling 911 for myself as I was crying uncontrollably in the corner. When the police officer arrived about 30 minutes later, I showed him the video of the assault, and I asked him, does this kind of thing happen all the time? He told me, yeah, this is normal, it happens all the time. I then asked him if I would be able to get a police report. He told me, no, there's no police report because there's no crime here. He then rushed me to my car to leave. I went home and my husband and I were discussing whether or not we should share the video. We wanted to protect the privacy of our family, but at the same time, we had heard there were over 2,400 attacks against the AAPI community since the pandemic started, and knew we had to share the video to raise awareness. After sharing the video on both Instagram and Facebook, it went viral. 99% of the comments and messages I received were very positive and uplifting. The other 1% were attacking me. They accused me of staging the incident, having a fake husband, fake crying. I deserved what happened to me. And I wanted to quit and pull down the video. At my moment of weakness, the next victim came forward to report that she was also assaulted by the same man in July of 2019 while she was with her 10-year-old son. That case has now been escalated to the city attorney's office. In my case, along with the 4 other victims that came forward, are now supporting her case. After the video went viral, LAPD contacted me to apologize for the responding officer's lack of action and ended up retraining all of their patrol officers on how to address acts of hate. Along with the help of LA versus Hate, which is LA County's hate initiative, and the Department of Employment and Fair Housing, we work with the restaurant to offer bystander intervention training. So that way the team members know what to do the next time there is a victim of hate in their establishment. And as we learned from Stop AAPI Hate earlier this year, the vast majority of these incidents are happening inside of businesses. So it's crucial that they provide training for their team members. I am also now the ambassador for the LA versus Hate initiative, where I get the honor and privilege to help other victims of hate by connecting them to resources, including counseling, legal aid, medical assistance, reimbursement for lost wages. And counseling was very critical for me. After my attack, I had PTSD, insomnia. I was afraid to go outside because I didn't know if the next person standing next to me would start assaulting me in the same manner. And so I'm very grateful to LA versus Hate for giving me the opportunity to get that resource. I am also now a partner with Advancing Justice LA and Stop AAPI Hate. Earlier this year, we saw a surge in attacks against the seniors in our community. We saw them being lit on fire, having acid thrown on them, having their faces slashed, and being robbed at gunpoint. As a result, I co-founded the nonprofit Seniors Fight Back in order to offer free self-defense training to our community. The goal is not to turn them into professional MMA fighters. Instead, it's to give them the tools and resources to be able to, number 1, prevent the attack from happening. And number 2, if it somehow still gets physical, they have the tools and knowledge to be able to get away from the attacker. During our classes, we also distribute free safety kits, which include safety alarms and pepper spray. And as of today, we have provided training to over 1,500 AAPI seniors. And our next event will be on November 7th in St. Gabriel, and all are welcome to attend. This past year, I've seen our community come together in ways I've never imagined. I've seen people, including strangers, that came together to organize and host rallies, vigils, neighborhood patrols, and even fundraise for pepper spray, safety alarms, and security guards to keep our community safe. Our next generations are no longer staying quiet. We're no longer keeping our heads down and afraid to make waves as we were taught growing up. We are loud, we are vocal, and we are standing up for our community. Prior to my incident, growing up, I was a very shy and timid person and very reserved. And after my incident, Hetty Chang from NBC reached out to me to do my first media interview. She took about 4 hours to convince me to do my first interview because I did not want to speak publicly. Since then, because of Hetty and her patience with me, I have been speaking on a local, national, and global platform for our community. I would like to thank my Seniors Fight Back team for volunteering to host these events with me and for funding every single event out of pocket because it's what's needed for our community right now. I would also like to thank all of the civil rights leaders for continuing to pave the way to put an end to hate. If you are ever a victim of hate, I strongly urge you to report and speak up, because chances are you may not be the only victim. And in my case, there were 5 other victims. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, United States Attorney General Merrick Garland, Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark, the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and all those gathered here today. Thank you for the opportunity to provide insight on how litigation and restorative justice can be tools to protect and defend survivors of hate crimes and their families after experiencing hate and extremism, both in person and online. Unfortunately, I know firsthand that in-person hate and online hate ruins lives by stoking fear, silencing voices, and causing harm to people's physical, professional, and mental safety, all of which have serious and lasting effects on victims and their families. 4 years, 5 months, and 24 days ago, I found myself at the center of a racially motivated hate crime in the nation's capital, on the campus of American University, during my junior year of college. I was subsequently the target of a threatening cyber harassment campaign at the hands of white supremacists. On April 30th, 2017, after returning from a sorority conference and receiving a competitive leadership award, I was sworn in as the first Black woman to hold the position of student government president. The following day, my first day in office, May 1st, 2017, a mass perpetrator hung bananas from Black corded nooses from light posts and bus stops around campus. The bananas were labeled with AKA and AKA free, referencing Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, the predominantly Black sorority of which I am a proud member, and Harambe Bait, referencing the gorilla that was killed at the Cincinnati Zoo in 2016. I was first notified about the hate crime from a fellow classmate who had seen the photos of the bananas hanging from nooses on social media. I then called a university administrator to inform her of what I had learned. It was at this point, however, that I was notified that the university police were already investigating this incident as a hate crime before anyone had informed, contacted, or reached out to me or anyone else in our chapter to let us know that our safety was at risk. This bigoted hate crime struck me to my core, as if the perpetrator was implying that I ought to be lynched or put down for making history. It also served as a painful reminder of both this country's legacy of lynching and racism, and that in my grandmother's lifetime, Emmett Till was killed, and in her granddaughter's time, she's faced her own similar threats. 2 days after the hate crime, I was notified that university police were working to investigate this case along with the Metropolitan Police Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Justice. The very next day, May 4th, 2017, images of my face were photoshopped to put sorry, that's my dog in the background, were photoshopped to put a Kentucky Fried Chicken bucket on my head, while nigger agitator, nigress, and she-boon were just a few of the hundreds of racist, sexist, and derogatory comments and innuendos that were posted across various social media platforms, chat rooms, and the dark net. On May 4th, I received an email from the Anti-Defamation League notifying me that a known neo-Nazi had incited a racially motivated cyber harassment campaign against me on social media. Andrew Anglin, founder of the anti-Semitic website, The Daily Stormer, named after Nazi Party newspaper Der Stürmer, encouraged his followers to, quote, send me some words of support by doxing me and providing his followers with a direct link to my Facebook page and my Twitter page. In other words, Anglin and many in his army of followers posted my personal information online with the intent for the information to be used to harass, stalk, and threaten me, and to be used against me for an unlawful purpose. Upon receiving the ADL's email, I did what any student educated in the post-Columbine era would do, which is to go into active shooter drill mode. So I closed all the lights, or turned off all the lights, closed all the blinds, turned off all the lights, sat low to the ground and out of sight of any window, and stayed as silent as I could while I placed a frantic call to my parents and then to the Metropolitan Police Department. What started as a week of celebrating a historic and personal achievement had turned into a never-ending nightmare. The week the hate crime occurred and the cyber harassment began coincided with our final exam period. During that time, I was expected to complete 4 final examinations with a 5th to complete the next week. Over the 96-hour period between May 1st and the minute I received the ADL's email, I had only 14 hours of sleep and just 1 full meal in my stomach. In the end, I was ultimately unable to complete my final examinations on time, and I had to finish my coursework over the summer. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, I continued my studies at American University, each day walking past the very places where the bananas and nooses were hung. I also had to change my privacy settings on all forms of social media, limit my interactions on the internet, increase my personal security measures, including but not limited to carrying pepper spray, putting up security cameras around my home, and receiving protection from the university, police, and local law enforcement. Eventually, I was diagnosed with PTSD, depression, and anxiety because of these hateful incidents, which caused me to suffer from flashbacks and lack of sleep due to intrusive thoughts and nightmares, lack of appetite due to stress that caused me to lose 20 pounds or 15% of my body weight, and intense feelings of being unsafe that appeared through panic attacks. There were days when I was unable to carry on a conversation without having an anxiety attack or being able to get out of bed and eat a meal. And there were definitely days when all I did was stare at the ceiling. Since Anglin's troll storm, some of the threatening, racist, and sexist comments directed at me on social media platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter over the past 4 years include, but are not limited to, quote, "I wonder what color the blood looks like." Quote, "I wish I knew her address. I would send her a noose so she could go hang herself and do the world a favor." Quote, "I think I'd take my chances with hiding her small tit body after her fatal accident. I'll take a few years for painting the street with her blood." Quote, "Just smash her in the head with a bike lock hard enough to split her head open with a wound that needed stitches. I seen you only get probation for that offense." And while I was doxxed by neo-Nazis 4 years ago, the harassment incited against me on various social media platforms continues to this day. I continue to receive threatening messages. Just because these threats happen online and digitally does not mean they need to be taken less seriously. Hate should never be normalized. I'm now used to reviewing, filtering, identifying, screenshotting, and saving multiple harassing and threatening comments on a monthly basis in the event that the comments rise to a level of a true threat, specifying time, place, and manner of attack in order to determine what's actionable for law enforcement. But I shouldn't have to be. Displacing this burden and putting it on those who have been impacted is just one of the reasons why hate crimes and hate incidents are underreported each year. Victims and survivors should not have to be the ones forced to jump through hurdles of navigating law enforcement bureaucracy and face re-traumatization just to report hate crimes and hate incidences, nor should they be the ones on the front line having to protect themselves from this kind of harassment. That's why on April 30th, 2018, just a day shy of the 1-year anniversary of the May 1 hate crime, I sued Andrew Anglin, the Daily Stormer's parent company, and 2 other defendants in federal court for violating the District of Columbia's Human Rights Act, which prohibits individuals from interfering with someone's use of public accommodations, with pro bono representation from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, the Washington Lawyers Committee, and Kirkland and Ellis LLP. With my lawyer's help, we were able to develop a novel approach to combating online racial and gender-based threats and harassment, using public accommodations law as a vehicle for justice, as well as to create a restorative justice-based settlement with one of the defendants. By mid-December 2018, I was well into my first year of law school when we entered into a groundbreaking settlement based around principles of restorative justice and the desire to heal both the victim and the perpetrator that required the defendant to issue a sincere in-person apology, which was recorded for educational purposes, to undergo anti-hate training and counseling, to commit 200 hours of community service related to racial justice, as well as to renounce and publicly advocate against hate, bigotry, and white supremacy. And while we were able to reach a settlement with one of the defendants in this case, we continued to pursue litigation against the remaining defendants. Our efforts were met with success on August 9, 2019, when Judge Rosemary M. Collier for the United States District of Columbia District Court set precedent in Dumpson versus Aid by ruling that racist online harassment can interfere with an individual's equal access to public accommodation, as I had to make significant changes to how I navigated campus on a day-to-day basis. Further, Judge Rosemary M. Collier found that a causal nexus exists between the troll storm created by Andrew Anglin and my enjoyment of American University, and she ultimately found that I was targeted of because of my race and my gender. Later that month, I met the defendant we settled with face-to-face, one of the many individuals who threatened me online and made racist comments and threats, and received the in-person apology that he gave. To this day, it is impossible for me to put into words exactly how the moment spent in the room for the apology made me feel, or to hypothesize about the sincerity of his apology. It is one aspect of my story that I'm continuing to work through. However, when I think back to that day, I draw the most strength from knowing that rather than to use that moment to center his words and accept his apology, as many people expected or assumed that I would do, I actually used that time as an opportunity to tell my own story, to explain to him the real harm he had caused, and to most importantly, use that time to hold him accountable. I speak from experience when I say that when perpetrators of racially and gender motivated attacks are not held accountable for their actions, instances of hate, bigotry, and prejudice run rampant. Bias motivated attacks, both online and in person, are no laughing matter, but you don't have to listen to me to understand that. Just look at the most recent hate crimes data released by the Justice Department. In 2020, hate crimes rose for the 6 of the past 7 years for the highest level in over a decade. Of note, we also saw a rise in anti-Black and anti-Asian hate crimes, likely linked to renewed calls for racial justice following the murder of George Floyd and the anti-Asian rhetoric used by elected officials and political candidates during the pandemic and the 2020 election cycle. But to be clear, hate crimes are not a partisan issue. They are an American issue and they are a threat to our democracy. Today, domestic and international extremists are using the internet for the purposes of recruiting and organizing and mobilizing their members of their digital community to commit threatening acts online and in person. This can be seen through the use of the internet to plan events by white nationalists like the Emmanuel AME church shooting, the Unite the Right rally, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, the Orlando Pulse nightclub attack, and the El Paso shooting, just to name a few. As a society, we cannot afford for these behaviors to go unchecked, or else we risk normalizing this kind of extremism. As a legal profession, we can't wait for the laws of yesterday to catch up to the laws of today and technology of today before we attempt to defend the civil rights of all with the tools that we have presently available to us. And as a human being, we can't afford to look away from injustice while waiting for other people to intervene. Together we can and we must use the tools at our disposal to come up with creative remedies to address the detrimental impact hate crimes and hate incidents have on our most vulnerable members of our community. Thank you for letting me share my story with you.